The first pair of meaningful manufacturing technologies are pottery and copper. Fired pottery enabled us to store our harvest for the lean seasons, while copper is the first metal we were able to forge into tools, the first of which were sickles to help us harvest wheat. The equipment required to forge this pair of products isn't particularly onerous. Clay can be shaped by hand or with a pottery wheel if you're extra fancy, whereas copper can be smelted from ore if it is heated in, you guessed it, a clay pot. Once you've got your copper metal, it's simply a matter of beating it with a rock into whatever shape you find relevant. Early manufacturing wouldn't have felt all that out of place at a retiree pottery class. Bit by bit, we got better, both at working materials and at pioneering the use of new ones. Copper sickles gave way to bronze scythes. Clay pots gave way to ceramics. Bronze spears gave way to iron swords. Wooden mugs gave way to glass bottles. Wool thread gave way to cotton cloth. But in a way, everything from the dawn of civilization right up to the 1700s shared a certain characteristic: organizational simplicity. There was no Home Depot to run to repeatedly to source parts. Most things you made yourself. If you were lucky, you had a blacksmith neighbor, but even his supply system couldn't be confused with complexity. It was one dude, a forge, a hammer, some tongs, and a barrel of water. If he had an eye for the future, he had an assistant and an apprentice, and that was about it. Such cottage industries faced extreme limitations. Blacksmiths and skilled folks like them couldn't just go out to the town square and recruit labor. They had to train it for years. There was no rapid technological progress. There were no rapid capacity build-outs. The Industrial Revolution changed the math in three critical ways. First, the Industrial Revolution not only gifted us with steel, less brittle, more workable, and more durable than iron, it gifted us with huge volumes of steel so that workers could access the raw metal without having to forge it themselves. With that messy, expensive, dangerous step taken care of, skilled workers could focus on adding value and specializing further. For the first time in human history, specialists in multiple fields could meaningfully collaborate. Interaction brought advancement. Second, the Industrial Revolution brought us precision manufacturing, both in tools and molds. One of the major drawbacks of cottage industry is that no two parts are exactly the same, so no two finished products are exactly the same. If something breaks, there is no plugging in a replacement piece. Either the entire item had to be chucked, or it needed to be taken to a skilled smith to craft a fundamentally new, customized part. In war, this was particularly annoying. Muskets were great and all, but if a single piece malfunctioned, you were left with an expensive, low-quality club. Advancements in precision did an end run around this restriction. Now, identical parts could be made by the dozen, or 1,000. For the first time in human history, manufacturing had scale. Third, the Industrial Revolution brought us fossil fuels. We've already covered their role in generating power and enabling us to move beyond muscle and water, but there's far more to oil and coal than that. Derivatives of the pair of power fuels often have nothing to do with energy at all. Paints, pigments, antibiotics, solvents, painkillers, nylon, detergents, glass, inks, fertilizers, plastics. For the first time in human history, we didn't take a minor step forward as we did from bronze to iron. We instead experienced an explosion in material science applications. The three improvements dovetail nicely. If skilled workers don't need to master every single step, they can get really good at one or two. Bam! Increasingly diverse skill sets and increasingly complex products. Apply that hyper-skill capacity to a larger scale, and nearly any product can be produced en masse. Bam! Assembly lines, machinery, automobiles, and telephones. Apply those concepts to dozens of new materials, and the entirety of the human condition is remade. Bam! Modern medicine, high-rise cities, advanced agriculture. Taken together, these three improvements in specialization, in scale, and in product reach changed the math of the possible and gave us our first real glimpse of what we today recognize as manufacturing. There were still plenty of limitations. Not every place had good coal or good iron ore or all the other industrial inputs, and trade remained a dubious business. If you were dependent upon a foreign sovereign for something you needed, it wasn't simply about you trusting him or her in order to get the necessary inputs. It wasn't even about trusting him or her all the time. It was about you trusting all foreign sovereigns all the time. Any power that could reach into any part of any supply chain could wreck the whole thing, often inadvertently. Out of necessity and practicality, all manufacturing of all types was kept in-house. That naturally benefited certain geographies. Economies of scale are impossible with a skilled labor force of one. Industrialization enabled the development of industrial plants that would A, enable skilled labor to multiply their efforts by having each worker specialize on a specific task or part, and B, enable unskilled labor to come in and work the assembly lines. With the industrial code cracked, the questions became, how big could that industrial plant get? Just how specialized could the skilled workers become? How much territory and population could you access within your own system? In sussing that out, the old math of transport came into play. Any geography that could shuttle goods and people about in the pre-industrial age could now shuttle about intermediate goods. In addition to all their other advantages, the imperial systems with good internal geographies could now generate manufacturing, enabling economies of scale that others could only dream of. The first really big winner was Canal Britain, followed by Germany's Ruhr Valley and ultimately the American Steel Belt. Unsurprisingly, the economic competition among these centers of industry was central to games geopolitical between 1850 and 1945. But as big and important as the British, German, and American systems were, geopolitics restricted their economies of scale to within their own borders. It took the end of World War II to merge the entire planet into a single system and transform the global ocean into one gigantic, safe, navigable waterway. With the United States guaranteeing security for all international commerce and preventing the alliance members from either going to war with one another or having colonial empires, and opening the American consumer market to all interested parties, countries that could have never dreamed of industrializing suddenly could. All at once, the safe locations favored by geography had to compete with heretofore backward, unindustrialized locations. The rules changed. Manufacturing changed with them. A new set of criteria defined success. One of the fickle things about economic development is that the process isn't the same for everyone. Britain was first, France and the Low Countries mushed together in second place, Germany was third, America roughly fourth, followed by Japan. But because the technologies involved are constantly evolving, even among this first broad batch, the paths differed. Britain's process was slow because the Brits were literally making things up as they went along. Germany's development was far quicker, and not simply because the Brits were kind enough to blaze the path for others. Germany exists in a geopolitical pressure cooker, ringed by strategic and economic competitors. Even worse, the habitable bits of German lands on the Rhine, Danube, Weser, Elbe, and Oder rivers are, at best, loosely connected. It's easy for Germany's more consolidated neighbors to split it apart. If Germany fails to press every economic development process to the limit, it is overwhelmed. So the German industrialization experience of the late 1800s and early 1900s was absolutely frenetic. Germany also had some significant geographic advantages over the Brits when it came to capital generation and supply chain management. The German river system, in particular the Rhine-Ruhr system of Western Germany, is the densest network of naturally navigable waterways in the world. It is perfect for industrialization. In particular, the Ruhr region has some of Europe's best coal deposits, and none of those pesky water table problems that so hindered the Brits. Add it up, and German industrialization was less a meander and more of a nervous, I think someone is following me jog. The Americans' process was far slower, nearly as slow as the Brits, but for wildly different reasons. While the German industrialization process didn't really get going until the 1830s, the really intense part was between 1880 and 1915, well under a human lifetime. In the United States, the beginning of the process, the start of the railroad era, was similarly in 1830. But American cities were not fully industrialized until the 1930s, and the American countryside not until the 1960s. In many ways, the American experience was an inverse image of the German one. There was no geopolitical pressure, so no need to speed things along. And while the Germans had a very dense industrial, riverine, and population footprint, the Americans were all sprawled out. The useful lands of the United States are about 25 times the area of the useful lands of pre-World War I Germany. And the Americans didn't have anything resembling a state industrial policy until they were in World War II. For the Americans, everything has always been rather la-di-da. Japan was a latecomer to the first round, not really gaining traction until the Meiji Restoration of 1868 gutted the old feudal order. But like the Germans, the Japanese shot ahead quickly out of necessity. The home islands are poor in pretty much every imaginable raw material, whether oil or bauxite. So Japan had no choice but to forge an empire in order to secure the materials required for industrialization. Since that meant taking other people's stuff, the Japanese had no choice but to move very quickly. The Koreans were early victims of the Japanese expansion and remained colonized until the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings freed them. They then went on to be among the order's most enthusiastic participants, becoming the vanguard of industrialization's second major wave. Their industrialization path can be best defined as a panicky sprint. The Koreans, even today, are desperate to protect their sovereignty from all things Japanese. The Koreans are the people who lacked a sufficiently large dry dock to build a supertanker, so they built the ship in halves and then built the dry dock around the halves to finish the project. The Southeast Asian states run the gamut. Singapore followed nearly a Korean path for similar reasons, with the part of the Japanese villain being played by Malaysia. Vietnam prioritized political unity over economic development, and so remained pre-industrialized and poor until the 1990s, unless you're in Ho Chi Minh City, aka Saigon, in which case you were industrialized a century ago, courtesy of French capital. Even in 2022, Vietnam feels less like two different countries and more like two different planets. Thailand, far more historically confident in its ability to repel invaders, the country's core is ringed by jungle mountains, lies somewhere between both in terms of pacing and outcome. The point of this little diversion into the practical outcomes of economic theory is that not everyone is at the same level, developmentally speaking, or even proceeding at the same pace. This can be awful, in that countries that are further along tend to have more oomph to their economic systems in terms of productivity, wealth, and diversification, and can use that oomph to lord over less advanced systems. Welcome to colonialism, neo or otherwise. But this differentiation can also be great, in that if the macro-strategic environment doesn't allow traditional colonialism, like, say, the American-led global order, there are hefty arguments to be made for manufacturing integration. Between the changed geostrategic environment of the order and the rise of containerized shipping, the security and cost concerns that had prevented meaningful cross-border integration since the dawn of time had finally unclenched. In any manufactured product that has more than one piece, there are opportunities for efficiencies. Take something really simple, a wooden top. There's the conical spinny thing and the rod-like spindle, typically glued together. While it is reasonable to expect the cone and the rod to be fashioned by the same woodworker, said woodworker probably didn't make the glue. Paint said top, and we're already up to 3. Apply that basic concept of specialization to a cell phone. Display screen, battery, transformer, wiring, sensors, camera, modem, data processor, system on a chip. That last is a fancy little gadget that includes a video processor, a display processor, a graphics processor, and the phone's central processing unit. Nobody would expect one worker to be able to make all of it. Nobody would expect the worker who plugs in the relatively low-tech wiring to be compensated at the same rate as the worker who fine-tunes the sensors. Imagine if all the pieces were made in Japan, a country with a per capita income of some $41,000. That system on a chip would be pretty fly, and it should be. The Japanese excel at complex microelectronic work. But it stretches the mind to think that there might be some Japanese dude who loves to run an injection mold system to make the phone case for $1 an hour. The combination of cheap, sacrosanct shipping and nearly endless workforce variety enabled manufacturers to split apart their supply chains into ever more complex, more discrete steps. If you were to trace the full supply chain of a car, you'd need metals including platinum, chrome, and aluminum, wrapped in soldered wires, a full diagnostic and performance-enhancing computer system, rubber for the tires, synthetic fabrics made from petroleum, plastics for the interior, glass and mirrors, gears and pistons, ball bearings, and injection-molded buttons to turn the radio all the way up to 11. Each of these, and each of the 30,000 other parts that go into a standard passenger vehicle I did not list, has its own highly customized workforce and its own supply chain. Each part has to be assembled into an intermediate product, air conditioning, engine, lighting, etc., by its own workforce, and then assembled into another intermediate product, dashboard, car frame, by its own workforce, and on until the whole mess of stuff finally reaches assembly. The supply chains of U.S. automaker Ford are among the most complex of any firm in existence, tapping more than 60 countries and 1,300 direct suppliers that together have more than 4,400 manufacturing sites. In reality, we're not quite done. If final assembly happens in Chongqing, China, the vehicle will be shipped down the Yangtze for 8 to 11 days, dwell at Shanghai for a few days, then get sent on to Los Angeles with a sailing time of 20 days, before getting loaded onto a train en route to a regional distribution center, and finally one of those specialized trucks you see on the interstate that shuttles the final product from the rail yard to the dealership. Even once the car is finished, it still takes about 6 weeks to get to a point of sale. Nor is it all about assembly and transport. The insurance for the ship most likely came from London, and the regulations that make sure that the gas cap won't somehow murder you in your sleep came from the European Union. The EU is more notorious than California for its bizarro regulations. At each step, the need for inputs expands. At each step, the differentiation of the input stream expands. At each step, the demand for supporting infrastructure expands. At each step, the need for petroleum to fuel everything expands. All this occurred in bits and pieces between the Americans and their core Cold War allies throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. But with the Cold War's end, the scope for the differentiation became truly global, and the pace accelerated to lightning speeds. Such increases in complexity and value now play out across every manufactured product. Consequently, in the 20 years following 1996, a period that includes the Great Recession, global maritime trade doubled by volume and tripled by value. Trade that to that point had required 5 millennia to build. Everything didn't simply get bigger in the post-Cold War globalized world. Everything got faster as well. As recently as the 1970s, about the only way to source intermediate goods was via bulk purchases. In the bad old pre-container days, not only was shipping more expensive, it was organizationally clumsy. Time would stretch out between purchases, so it was more cost-effective to purchase a lot at once and maintain a warehouse. Storage wouldn't be cheap, but it would be cheaper than paying for lots of small orders beset by erratic delivery schedules. More important, all that inventory was necessary to prevent the unthinkable, having to halt production because you ran out of a specific widget. Containerization changed the math by making shipping more reliable, enabling firms to push their inventory back onto vessels, and enabling smaller orders to be produced at more reasonable costs. Toyota in particular realized that with changed shipping norms, manufacturing could evolve from a big batch model to more of a steady product stream. This new just-in-time inventorying system allows firms to place orders for a few-day supply of widgets as little as a month in advance, with those fresh supplies arriving just as their last orders were running out. These systems exist for a few reasons. The most important is to help companies with cash flow. Put simply, the less inventory a company holds, the less cash is tied up at any given time, enabling firms to do other things with the savings. Useful investments, capacity expansion, workforce training, R&D, etc. To put this in perspective, consider the iPhone. In 2020, Apple sold 90 million iPhones, a cost savings of just a penny a unit via just-in-time would add up to a cool $1 million savings. In just calendar year 2004 for just US firms, such inventory savings amounted to $80 to $90 billion annually. In a globalized system, supply chains are not simply about achieving economies of scale. They are about matching each part and process to an economy and workforce that handle the work most efficiently, all in the shortest possible amount of time. One of the many things that makes modern computing and telephony and electronics possible is that the world is awash with workforces and economies at different stages of the development path, while at the same time, the macro-strategic environment enables all those various systems to interact peaceably and smoothly. Just in time is the logical conclusion of humanity producing sufficient surplus foodstuffs to support people who could specialize, like that once all-important blacksmith. And like intermediate manufacturers trade in general, it is possible only because the global transport system has become so reliable.